city of Eldritch had always been a place of mystery. A city shrouded in fog, where the streets twisted like serpents, and the buildings stood as silent sentinels under a moonless sky. The people who lived there had long learned to live with the darkness, to embrace it as part of their existence. But none of them truly understood what lay beneath, what whispered in the shadows, waiting. Arthur Blackwood had never been one to believe in the stories, those ancient tales of vampires, creatures of the night who thrived on blood and terror. He was a man of reason, a scholar who believed only in what he could see and touch. But that night, as he stood at the edge of the old cemetery, something stirred within him. A feeling that he could not explain, a presence that seemed to watch him from the darkness. The wind howled through the broken gates of the cemetery, carrying with it the scent of decay. It was a smell Arthur knew all too well. It was the scent of time, of things forgotten and buried deep. But there was something else in the air, a lingering sense of dread, something ancient that should have stayed buried. Arthur's curiosity got the better of him, as it always did. He pushed open the rusted gates and stepped into the cemetery, the gravel crunching beneath his boots. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, leaving him in complete darkness. The only light came from the faint glow of the street lamps in the distance, casting long, eerie shadows across the gravestones. His eyes were drawn to a particular mausoleum at the far end of the cemetery, its entrance dark and foreboding. The stone was chipped and cracked, the inscriptions worn by time, and yet something about it seemed alive, as though it was watching him, waiting for him to come closer. Arthur approached the mausoleum, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached out to touch the stone, his fingers brushing against the cold surface. In that instant, a voice echoed in his mind, a voice that seemed both familiar and foreign, like a distant memory. "You should not be here." Arthur recoiled, his breath quickening. He looked around, but there was no one to be seen, just the wind rustling the dead leaves. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling, but there was no response. The cemetery remained silent, save for the wind. And then the door to the mausoleum creaked open. A figure stepped out from the shadows, its form barely visible against the darkness. It was tall, with an almost unnatural grace, and its eyes, glowing red, pierced through the gloom like twin burning embers. Arthur's heart skipped a beat. He could feel the presence of this figure, a weight in the air that made it hard to breathe. His mind screamed to run, but his feet remained rooted to the ground, as though some unseen force held him in place. The figure stepped closer, its face emerging from the shadows. It was a man, or something that had once been a man. His skin was pale, almost ashen, and his features were sharp, as though carved from stone. His lips curled into a smile, revealing teeth that were unnaturally long and sharp, teeth that gleamed in the darkness. "You are trespassing," the figure said, his voice low and smooth, like a dark lullaby. But that is of little consequence now. Arthur could not move. He could not speak. All he could do was watch, frozen in terror, as the figure drew nearer. Every step it took seemed to fill the air with a sense of impending doom. "I am Alistair," the figure continued, his eyes never leaving Arthur's. "And you are the first to come here in centuries. You should have stayed away." Arthur's throat went dry. "What are you?" he managed to whisper, his voice hoarse. Alistair smiled again, a cruel and knowing smile. "I am the one who has slept for too long, the one who has been forgotten. But now, I am awake, and you, Arthur Blackwood, are the one who has awakened me." Arthur's body was rigid, frozen in place by the unnatural presence of Alistair. The vampire's gaze, like fire, burned into his very soul. His heart hammered in his chest, but no matter how hard he tried, his limbs refused to move. Fear gripped him like a vice, paralyzing him. Alistair's smile deepened as he noticed Arthur's struggle. "Do not fear," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. Yet there was something else, something darker that lurked just beneath the surface. You are safe, for now, but you should never have come here. You should never have disturbed the dead. Arthur's mind raced, but the only words that escaped his lips were trembling, weak. What do you want from me? The vampire's eyes flashed dangerously. Want? Alistair chuckled, his voice like a whisper that echoed through the cemetery. I want nothing, except for what is rightfully mine. The curse that binds me, that keeps me in this state of restless sleep, is not my burden alone. It belongs to you as well. Arthur felt his legs weaken, and he stumbled back, hands pressed against the cold stone of the mausoleum. What are you talking about? He whispered, confusion mixing with growing dread. Alistair moved closer, his steps silent, like the wind itself. You, Arthur Blackwood, are the key to breaking the curse that has held me captive for centuries. Your blood, your soul, is the final piece of the puzzle. Arthur's breath hitched. No, I don't understand. I'm just a man. You are far more than just a man, Alistair hissed, his voice taking on a dark, hypnotic quality. You are a descendant of a line forgotten by time, a line that has long been linked to mine. Your blood has carried the seed of immortality for generations. The curse is in you, and only you can undo it. Arthur felt a cold chill wash over him as the vampire's words sank in. His blood, a descendant? He had known little of his ancestors beyond what the books told him. Just another family of scholars, no more extraordinary than any other. But now, standing before this creature, he felt as though his entire existence had been a lie, a mere precursor to something much darker. No, Arthur said firmly, finding a shred of strength. I will not help you. I will not become part of this madness. Alistair's face twisted in anger, and the air around them seemed to grow colder still. You do not have a choice, he said, his tone like steel. You have already awakened what was dormant within you. Now you will either join me in the darkness or die. Your fate is sealed. Suddenly, a low growl echoed from the darkness beyond the cemetery, a growl that seemed to vibrate the very ground beneath their feet. Arthur's heart skipped a beat, and he turned quickly, his eyes scanning the shadows. From the mist emerged a pair of glowing eyes, red like blood, burning with an unnatural hunger. The creature stepped forward, revealing a figure that was both horrifying and majestic. It was a woman, tall and slender, with pale skin that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. Her hair was long and black, cascading down her back like a dark waterfall. But what truly made her terrifying were her fangs. Long, razor-sharp, and glinting in the moonlight. She was a vampire, just like Alistair, but there was something about her presence that sent a shock of recognition through Arthur's veins. She spoke with a voice that was as cold as the grave. Alistair, you have waited too long. It is time to end this charade. Let him go. Alistair turned toward her, his eyes narrowing. Vera, he sneered. I had hoped you would not be part of this, but it seems fate has forced us to meet again. Vera's lips curled into a smile, revealing her own set of sharp fangs. Fate has nothing to do with it, Alistair. You know as well as I do that the time for this madness is over. You cannot keep him here. Arthur felt his mind spinning as the two vampires locked eyes. He was caught between them, unsure who to trust or what was happening. Every part of him screamed to run, but his body remained rooted in place, unable to break free. Vera stepped forward, her eyes softening for a moment as they landed on Arthur. You have been drawn into something much darker than you can imagine, she said gently. Alistair's curse is not just his own. It is an ancient power, one that has corrupted everything it touches. If you do not stop him, you will become a part of that darkness, and the world will be consumed. Arthur could feel the weight of her words settle deep within him, but his mind refused to accept it. I don't want any part of this. I just want to leave. Alistair let out a low laugh, dark and full of disdain. You think you have a choice? You are already bound, Arthur. And soon, you will understand just how much you are a part of this world. Before Arthur could respond, a sharp cry pierced the night, and he spun around to see a figure emerge from the mist. An old man, hunched and trembling, with eyes wide with terror. The man was muttering something under his breath, his words incoherent. I can't stop them, he gasped. The curse? It's spreading. It's too late. The man collapsed to the ground, his body limp. Alistair's eyes flashed with something resembling satisfaction. It is already too late. The curse is awakening once more. Arthur stumbled back, fear gripping him tightly as the weight of the situation settled in. The night had become darker, colder, and with it came the creeping realization that he was not just facing Alistair. He was facing the beginning of something far worse, something that had been waiting for centuries. Alistair stepped forward, his voice calm, but laden with finality. It is time for you to decide, Arthur. Will you embrace your destiny, or will you become another casualty of this eternal night? Arthur's breath came in shallow gasps, his heart thumping against his ribs as Alistair and Vera stood on either side of him, their presence overwhelming. The cemetery had transformed into a suffocating prison, the air thick with ancient power, and he was trapped within it, caught in the gravity of forces beyond his comprehension. The old man who had collapsed lay motionless at his feet, and the words he had spoken lingered in the air, heavy with menace. The curse? It's spreading. It's too late. Arthur couldn't tear his eyes away from the man's lifeless form. What had he meant? And what was this curse that had consumed him? Alistair stepped closer, his gaze never leaving Arthur's face. The vampire's voice was low, almost gentle, as he spoke. You see, Arthur, this is no mere curse. It is a legacy, a lineage that stretches back through the ages, one that cannot be ignored or denied. You are part of it now, whether you like it or not. Arthur's mind raced. He could feel the weight of Alistair's words pressing down on him, suffocating him. But there was a part of him, deep within, that refused to accept it. I'm just a man, he reminded himself. This is madness. Cannot be part of this legacy. Vera, who had been silent for a moment, finally spoke. You are not just a man, Arthur. You are something much more. You are the final piece, the key to ending this nightmare. But you must make a choice that will determine not only your fate, but the fate of all who live. Her words sent a chill down his spine. I don't want any part of this, Arthur said, his voice stronger now, despite the fear coursing through him. I just want to go home. Alistair chuckled, the sound dark and hollow. You cannot go home, Arthur. This is your home now, whether you accept it or not. And once you understand your true nature, once you embrace it, you will see the truth. Arthur felt a pull, a strange magnetism drawing him toward Alistair. The vampire's presence was powerful, inescapable, and the temptation to give in, to stop resisting, gnawed at the edges of his mind. But a part of him, the part that still clung to his humanity, pushed back against it. Suddenly, a violent wind whipped through the cemetery, the trees shaking as though trying to tear themselves from the ground. The air grew colder still, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer, swallowing the light. In the midst of this chaos, Arthur saw something that made his blood run cold. A figure stood at the far end of the cemetery, shrouded in darkness, its silhouette barely discernible against the blackness. It moved toward them with unnatural speed, its steps light but purposeful. Who's there? Arthur shouted, his voice cracking with fear. The figure stepped into the moonlight, revealing a face that was both haunting and familiar. It was a woman, her hair dark as midnight, her eyes glowing a faint amber. She wore a dark cloak that fluttered in the wind, and her features were sharp, like a predator, cold, beautiful, and deadly. Her eyes locked onto Arthur's, and for a brief moment, he felt a surge of recognition, though he couldn't explain why. He had never seen her before, yet she seemed familiar. "Arthur Blackwood," the woman said, her voice a melody of both danger and promise. "You do not know me, but I know you." Alistair turned to face the woman, his expression shifting to one of intense focus. "Sabrina," he muttered, as though he had been expecting her. "I thought you were dead." The woman, Sabrina, smiled, her teeth gleaming in the pale light. "You thought I was dead, but I am far from it, Alistair, and I am here to stop you." Arthur's mind reeled as the two vampires stood facing each other. He had no idea who this woman was, but the way Alistair reacted, like a man who had been caught off guard, sent a wave of unease through him. "You are a fool, Sabrina," Alistair hissed. "You know as well as I do that there is no stopping this now. The curse is already in motion. The bloodline has awakened." Sabrina's eyes flickered toward Arthur, and for the first time, there was a glimmer of something softer in her gaze. "Arthur," she said, her voice full of urgency. "Listen to me. You have to choose. Alistair is using you, feeding off your blood, your essence. He will consume you until there is nothing left. The curse will take everything from you." Arthur took a step back, his heart racing. What are you saying? What do I do?" "You must make a choice," Sabrina replied, stepping forward slowly. "You must either give in to the darkness that Alistair offers you, or you must fight it, break free from it, and destroy him." Alistair's laugh cut through the air, bitter and menacing. "Destroy me? You are deluded, Sabrina. He will never choose you. He will never choose the light. He is mine." The air between the three of them thickened, charged with an electricity that crackled with danger. Arthur felt as though the very ground beneath him was shifting, the weight of their words pressing down on him from all sides. He was caught between them. Alistair, the seductive vampire who promised power and immortality, and Sabrina, the mysterious woman who spoke of light, of hope, of freedom. But Arthur didn't know which path to take. His mind was a storm of confusion, fear, and the haunting knowledge that whatever choice he made, it would cost him everything. And just as the tension reached its peak, a piercing scream echoed from the distance, cutting through the night like a blade. The scream was followed by a roar, a sound that chilled Arthur to his very core. The scream that had shattered the night sent a shockwave through Arthur's chest. It was the kind of scream that wasn't just a cry of pain, but a sound so primal, so raw, it seemed to tear at the fabric of reality itself. Arthur turned toward the direction of the scream, his eyes wide with terror. But before he could react, a low, rumbling growl echoed from the darkness beyond the cemetery. It was a sound that sent his heart racing, a sound that was not entirely human, but something more, something worse. The growl grew louder, and Arthur could feel the ground beneath his feet tremble, as though the very earth was alive, responding to the threat that was approaching. He turned to face Alistair and Sabrina, both of whom had gone still, their eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. "What is it?" Arthur whispered, his voice shaking. Alistair's expression had darkened, and for the first time, Arthur saw something in the vampire's eyes, a flicker of fear. "It is coming," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "And when it arrives, all will be lost." Sabrina's gaze was fixed on the shadowy silhouette that had begun to take shape in the distance. "We cannot let it get any closer," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "If that thing reaches us, we will have no chance of survival." Arthur felt the cold grip of fear tighten around his chest. Whatever it was coming for them, and there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The cemetery, which had once seemed like a place of forgotten rest, now felt like a trap, a death trap, ready to consume them all. Without another word, Sabrina moved with unnatural speed, her form a blur as she darted into the darkness. Arthur's instinct screamed at him to follow, but before he could make a move, Alistair grabbed his arm, his grip like iron. "Do not be a fool, Arthur," Alistair hissed. "You cannot outrun what is coming. No one can." Arthur struggled to free himself from Alistair's grip, but the vampire's strength was overwhelming. "Let me go," Arthur shouted, his voice desperate. "We need to leave now." But Alistair's eyes gleamed with an intensity that sent a chill through Arthur's spine. "You cannot leave," Alistair said, his voice steady and calm, as though speaking to a child. "You are already bound to this place. The darkness is already in you." Arthur's mind swirled in confusion, his thoughts a blur. "What do you mean?" he demanded, his heart racing. "What is happening here?" Alistair's gaze softened, but only for a moment. "The curse, Arthur, it has already begun, and the creature that is coming, it is the source, the origin of the bloodline, the one who made us what we are." Arthur felt his blood run cold at the implication. "You mean, it's one of you?" he whispered, his voice trembling with fear. Alistair nodded slowly, his eyes filled with something like regret. "Yes, and now it has come to reclaim what is rightfully its own. To reclaim you." Before Arthur could respond, the growl intensified, and then, from the darkness, a figure emerged. It was massive, its form towering above them, its outline barely discernible in the shadows. Its body was covered in tattered robes, and its face, if it could be called a face, was a grotesque, shifting mask of features, neither human nor beast. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were two glowing orbs of amber, burning with a ferocity that made Arthur's heart stop. The creature's presence was suffocating, as though the very air had turned heavy with its power. Its gaze locked onto Arthur, and for a moment, he felt as though his soul had been laid bare before it. "You," the creature rumbled, its voice low and guttural. "You are the one who has awakened the bloodline. You are the one who will bring it all back." Arthur's knees buckled, and he fell to the ground, his body shaking uncontrollably. He tried to look away, but the creature's eyes held him captive, pulling him in like a moth to a flame. Alistair stepped forward, his voice calm but filled with a deep sorrow. "The creature you see before you is not just a monster, Arthur. It is our creator, the first of our kind." The words hit Arthur like a blow to the chest. "The first?" he gasped. "But how can that be? How can something like that exist?" Sabrina appeared at his side then, her face pale and set with determination. "It is not a matter of how, Arthur. It is a matter of what, and it has come to claim you." The creature took a step forward, its massive form looming over them. Arthur could feel the weight of its presence pressing down on him, suffocating him. It was as though the very earth beneath him was bending to its will. "I am the one who began it all," the creature said, its voice like thunder. "And now, I will finish it." Before Arthur could respond, the creature lunged forward with terrifying speed. His heart raced, his body frozen with terror. But just as it reached him, Sabrina leaped into the air, intercepting the creature with a ferocity that left Arthur breathless. The two vampires clashed in the darkness, their movements a blur as they fought with incredible speed and power. Alistair was at Arthur's side in an instant, his grip tightening around his arm. "You must make a choice now," Alistair said, his voice urgent. "You can join us and fight for your survival, or you can refuse and die here. The choice is yours, Arthur." Arthur's heart pounded in his chest as he watched Sabrina and the creature fight. His thoughts were a whirlwind of fear and confusion, but one thing was clear: if he did nothing, they would all be destroyed. The fight between Sabrina and the creature raged on in the shadows, a violent dance of power and speed. Each clash sent tremors through the ground beneath them, the sheer force of their blows creating waves in the air. Arthur's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the battle unfold, unable to take his eyes off the creature. This being that had been the origin of all vampires, the force that had begun the bloodline, and now had come to claim him. Alistair's grip on his arm was unyielding, pulling him closer, as though trying to shield him from the chaos. "Arthur, you must choose," he said urgently, his voice sharp with desperation. "You are not just a man anymore. You are part of this. You must choose whether to join us and fight, or let everything end in destruction." Arthur could barely hear him over the sounds of the battle, the growls and the clash of supernatural strength echoing in the night. He could feel his mind spinning, torn between the possibility of embracing the darkness, of joining the very creature that had caused so much destruction, and the fear of becoming something he couldn't understand. "Why me?" Arthur gasped, his voice hoarse with confusion. "Why am I the key? I'm just a man. I don't belong here." Alistair's face softened, his eyes filled with an emotion Arthur couldn't quite read. "You are not just a man, Arthur. You are the blood of my line. You carry the legacy that was passed down through centuries. It is you who can end this curse or perpetuate it." Arthur turned toward Sabrina, still locked in battle with the creature. Her movements were fast, precise, but even she seemed to struggle against the power of the creature. The vampire, the first of their kind, was relentless. With each strike, Sabrina was pushed back, her form growing weaker as the creature's power overwhelmed her. "No," Arthur whispered, his heart sinking. Sabrina, the one who had tried to warn him, the one who had promised him a way out, was losing. Alistair saw the hesitation in Arthur's eyes, the indecision, and it was then that he pulled Arthur toward him, his voice now almost pleading. "Do you want to see her die, Arthur? Do you want to watch as the last hope of stopping this curse fades away?" Arthur clenched his fists, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He looked back at Sabrina, fighting valiantly but slowly being overpowered. Her blood spilled onto the ground, a reminder of the terrible price they were all paying. "I don't want this," Arthur whispered, more to himself than to Alistair. "I don't want to be part of this." But even as the words left his lips, he felt the pull within him, an undeniable force, the very essence of the curse that had begun to awaken in him, calling to him. The bloodline was alive in his veins, and it demanded something that Arthur couldn't ignore. "Then choose," Alistair hissed. "Choose before it is too late." Arthur turned back to the fight. Sabrina was struggling, gasping for breath, her form faltering as the creature loomed over her, ready to deliver the final blow. The world seemed to slow, and in that moment Arthur made his decision. With a roar that was both human and monstrous, he lunged forward, ignoring the fear that had once paralyzed him. The creature turned, its amber eyes glowing with malice, just in time to see Arthur's outstretched hand. Arthur felt a surge of power rush through him as he tapped into the bloodline within him. The darkness, the very thing he had tried to resist, welcomed him, giving him strength, speed, and a hunger he could barely understand. It was as if the creature's power flowed into him, fusing with his own essence, awakening the vampire within. The creature's eyes widened in shock as Arthur's fist connected with its chest, sending it stumbling back. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Arthur standing there, surrounded by shadows, the creature reeling from the blow. Sabrina looked up, her eyes wide with disbelief as Arthur's transformation began to take shape. She had seen many things in her long life, but nothing like this, nothing that could have prepared her for what was happening now. You're one of us now," Sabrina said, her voice tinged with awe and fear. Arthur stood, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the transformation complete. His eyes, now glowing an eerie amber, reflected the creature's essence. The curse had taken hold of him, and with it, the power to change everything. The creature, still recovering, let out a low growl. You are mine now," it said, its voice filled with rage and disbelief. Arthur looked at it, the weight of the choice now upon him. "No," he said. said, his voice cold and filled with determination. "I am no longer yours. I choose to end this." With a swift motion, he drove his hand forward, piercing the creature's heart. The darkness that had plagued the world for centuries began to writhe in agony, the creature's power crumbling beneath his touch. The roar of its final scream echoed through the cemetery, a sound that would forever be etched in Arthur's mind. As the creature fell, vanishing into the shadows from whence it came, Arthur stood over its defeated form, breathing heavily, his body still thrumming with the power of the bloodline. But even as the creature died, Arthur knew that the battle was far from over. The curse had not been fully broken. It had merely shifted, taking on a new form, and the world was still at the mercy of the darkness he had just embraced. Sabrina, still panting from the fight, walked toward him. "You did it," she said, her voice a mix of relief and fear. "But now you must be ready. The real battle is only just beginning." Arthur looked at her, his amber eyes reflecting a new understanding. He had made his choice, and now he had to live with it. He had become part of something ancient, something dark, but it was not too late to make it right. The cold wind howled through the cemetery, carrying with it the scent of decay and death, as if the earth itself was mourning what had just occurred. Arthur stood in the aftermath of the battle, his amber eyes glowing with a strange, eerie light. His body still hummed with the power of the bloodline, and though the creature, the source of the curse, lay defeated at his feet, a new, more terrifying reality had begun. Sabrina stood beside him, her face a mixture of awe and apprehension. She had watched him transform before her eyes, had witnessed his descent into the very darkness they had fought to avoid. But now there was no turning back. "You've done it," she said softly, her voice trembling. "The first of our kind is gone, but the bloodline still lives. The curse, it isn't over. It's only just begun." Arthur turned to her, his gaze hard and unyielding. "Then we will finish it," he said, his voice low, cold. "The creature is dead, but the curse has always been more than just one being. It's a force that spreads, that corrupts, and I won't let it consume me or anyone else." Sabrina nodded, her expression filled with a mixture of fear and respect. "But you are not the only one who has felt the curse's pull. There are others who walk the earth, vampires like Alistair, who will stop at nothing to claim the power you have awakened." Arthur felt a pang of uncertainty. He had embraced the darkness to save Sabrina, to end the creature's reign. But now, standing in the ruins of the battle, he realized that the price was far higher than he had anticipated. He could feel the hunger within him, the thirst for blood that was now an undeniable part of his existence. It was a craving that threatened to overwhelm him, to consume him from the inside out. But he could not give in. Not now. "We must find them," Arthur said, his voice firm with determination. "Alistair, the others, they will come for me. They will come for the power I now possess." Sabrina's eyes darkened. "They will come for you, Arthur, and they will not stop until they have either broken you or turned you into one of them. You are no longer just a man. You are something else. Something they will see as a threat or an opportunity." Arthur could feel the weight of her words settle over him like a cloak of dread. He had once been a man, a scholar, a simple man who had never believed in the supernatural. But now he was a creature of the night, bound by the very curse he had sought to destroy. The thirst for blood was constant, gnawing at him, and the power that surged through his veins was a reminder of just how much he had changed. "I can't be like them," Arthur said, his voice tight with a mixture of anger and fear. "I can't let this darkness consume me." Sabrina stepped closer, her eyes filled with understanding. "I know," she said softly, "but that is the choice you must make every moment of your existence now. You are bound to the bloodline, but you are also bound to the world of light. You must find a balance, Arthur, or it will destroy you." Arthur nodded slowly, the weight of his new reality settling over him like a shroud. He had made his choice, but that choice had irrevocably altered the course of his life. He was no longer just a man, he was something more, something ancient and dangerous. And yet, a part of him still held onto the hope that he could redeem himself, that he could fight the very curse he had become a part of. The silence of the cemetery pressed down on them, and for a moment, Arthur and Sabrina stood in the stillness, contemplating the path ahead. The battle was far from over, and they knew it, but they also knew that their next move would determine everything, whether they would succumb to the darkness or fight for the light. Suddenly, a distant, echoing howl pierced the air. It was not a wolf's howl, but something more sinister. Something that made the hair on the back of Arthur's neck stand on end. The howl echoed again, closer this time, and Arthur could feel the ground beneath his feet tremble with the power of it. "It's them," Sabrina said, her voice low, full of warning. "They've come." Arthur turned toward the sound, his amber eyes burning with a mixture of anger and anticipation. He could feel it now, the presence of others like him, drawn to the power he had awakened, ready to claim it for themselves. "We have no time," Arthur said, his voice filled with a new sense of purpose. "We have to stop them before it's too late." Sabrina nodded, her eyes sharp with resolve. "Follow me," she said, turning on her heel. "The fight is not over yet, but we can't win if we're unprepared. We need to find the others who can help us. There are those who are still loyal to the light, and they'll help us in this fight. But we don't have much time." Arthur followed her, his senses heightened, the bloodline within him now fully awakened. He could feel the presence of the vampires, their power rippling through the air, and he knew that the true battle was just beginning. The world had changed, and he was no longer just a man. But now he would fight, not for the darkness, but for the chance to redeem the very curse he had been born into. The howl echoed once more, louder this time, sending a chill down Arthur's spine. It wasn't just a cry of a lone creature, but the warning call of a pack, an army of vampires, drawn to the power that he now possessed. The ground beneath him seemed to tremble with anticipation, as if the earth itself was responding to the growing threat. Sabrina, who had been moving swiftly ahead, turned back to Arthur. Her eyes were wide with urgency, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. "We must hurry," she said. "They're already here." Arthur nodded, but his heart was heavy with uncertainty. He had already embraced the darkness within him, but now he was beginning to understand the full cost of that decision. The hunger inside him, the thirst for blood, was constant, gnawing at his very being. The pull to become something more, to give in to the power that surged through him, was overwhelming. But he couldn't allow himself to succumb. Not yet. "Where are we going?" Arthur asked, his voice hoarse, still feeling the aftereffects of the battle. "What do we do now?" Sabrina's face softened, though the fear still lingered in her eyes. "There are others, Arthur. Others who still believe in the light. We need to find them, vampires who have not succumbed to the curse, who still fight to protect humanity. They are scattered, but they will help us. They are the only ones who can help us stop this." Arthur followed her, his senses heightened, the bloodline inside him pulsing with every step. He could feel the presence of the other vampires, their power growing closer with each passing second. The air was thick with their energy, and the hunger inside him was becoming unbearable. As they moved deeper into the woods, the howls grew louder, closer. The trees seemed to close in around them, casting long, twisting shadows in every direction. Arthur's instincts screamed at him to fight, to confront the approaching vampires, but Sabrina held up a hand, stopping him. "Not yet," she whispered. "We have to be strategic. If we confront them now, we'll be overwhelmed." Arthur gritted his teeth, the hunger gnawing at him, the urge to let the darkness take over, to embrace the power that had been awakened inside him. But he forced himself to stay in control, his mind focused on the task ahead. "Why are they coming for me?" Arthur asked, his voice filled with confusion and fear. "What do they want?" Sabrina's eyes flickered with a mix of sorrow and determination. "They want what you've awakened, Arthur. They want the bloodline. The curse, the power, it was meant to stay buried. But now, with you, it has been reborn. And they will stop at nothing to claim it for themselves." Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows ahead, its movement fluid and quick. Arthur's eyes narrowed, his senses alert, but Sabrina's voice stopped him from attacking. "Hold your ground," she whispered. "It's one of us." The figure stepped into the light, revealing a tall, slender man with dark hair and pale skin, his eyes cold and calculating. He was dressed in dark clothing, his features sharp, like a predator. Someone who had been a part of the world for centuries, but who had never fully embraced the darkness. "Sabrina," the man said, his voice smooth and calm, but with an undercurrent of danger. "I see you've brought the new one with you." Arthur took a step back, instinctively preparing for a fight. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice low and filled with suspicion. The man smiled, revealing sharp, gleaming fangs. "My name is Lucian," he said, "and I'm here to help. Though I must admit, I'm surprised you survived the night. Most who embrace the bloodline don't last as long as you have." Sabrina's expression hardened, her stance shifting as she prepared herself for any sudden moves. "Lucian," she said, her tone filled with distrust. "You're one of them. How do I know we can trust you?" Lucian chuckled softly, the sound cold and devoid of warmth. "I'm not here to cause trouble, Sabrina. I'm here to make sure you don't make a grave mistake. The bloodline you've awakened is dangerous. More dangerous than you can possibly understand. And if you want to survive, you'll need all the help you can get." Arthur clenched his fists, his frustration boiling over. "Help? From you? You're a vampire just like Alistair, just like the others. How do I know I can trust you?" Lucian's gaze turned to Arthur, his eyes cold and piercing. "You can't trust anyone, Arthur, not even yourself. But that doesn't mean we don't have a common enemy. Alistair and his followers want the bloodline, but they won't stop at just taking it. They'll destroy everything in their path to get what they want." Arthur's pulse quickened as Lucian's words sank in. He knew that Alistair's followers, vampires like him, would not stop at anything to gain control over the power he now possessed. And as much as he hated to admit it, Lucian's words rang true. He needed help whether he liked it or not. "So what do you want from me?" Arthur asked, his voice harsh but tinged with desperation. "Why should I trust you?" Lucian smiled again, this time with a hint of something more genuine. "I want the same thing you want, Arthur, to end this curse. But to do that, we'll need to fight together. You, me, and anyone else who stands with us." Sabrina stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. "How do we know you're not just using us, Lucian?" Lucian's expression shifted, his eyes darkening. "Because if I wanted to use you, I would have killed you both already." Arthur and Sabrina exchanged a glance. The tension between them was palpable, but in that moment, Arthur knew that their only chance of survival was to unite, even if it meant putting their trust in someone they weren't sure of. "Fine," Arthur said, his voice steady. "But if you betray us, I won't hesitate to destroy you." Lucian's smile faded, his expression serious. "I don't expect you to trust me, Arthur, but we don't have time to waste. They're coming." The howl in the distance grew louder, a chorus of voices rising up to meet them. The pack was closing in. The howls had now become deafening, reverberating through the trees, the very air thick with the presence of vampires. An army that had been waiting for the right moment to strike. Arthur could feel the tension building inside him, the bloodline within him stirring as the hunger grew stronger with every passing moment. He was no longer just a man. The vampire inside him was fully awake, and he could feel its power pushing against his will. Lucian, who had remained calm up until this point, now looked towards the dark horizon, his eyes narrowing. "They're here," he said, his voice low and filled with a deadly certainty. "We don't have much time." Arthur could feel the pull of the darkness in the distance. The other vampires, Alistair's followers, were approaching. Their presence was a suffocating weight, something that pressed against his very soul. He could feel their hunger, their thirst for power, and the bloodline that he now carried within him. It was calling to them, drawing them closer. Sabrina's hand rested on Arthur's shoulder, her grip firm. "Stay focused," she said. "The hunger within you is strong, but you must control it. If you lose yourself to it, you'll be no better than the monsters we're fighting." Arthur nodded, but the temptation was becoming unbearable. He could already feel the gnawing craving in his throat, the urge to give in, to take what was his. The bloodline thrummed within him like a beating drum, urging him to embrace it, to allow it to consume him. "No," he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible. "I will not lose myself." Lucien's eyes flickered to him, as if sensing the internal struggle. "It's not so easy, is it?" he said, a smirk crossing his lips. "The bloodline awakens, and it takes everything. But remember, Arthur, you can still fight it. You must fight it." Arthur clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. The sound of the vampires closing in was getting louder, the rustle of their movements now almost tangible. They were circling, waiting for the right moment to strike. Lucien turned to Sabrina, his expression dark. "We'll need a plan. We can't face them head on. Not yet. They're too strong." Sabrina nodded, her eyes hard. "We fight smart, then. We use the darkness to our advantage. Arthur, you need to stay in control. If you let them see your weakness, it'll be over before it begins." Arthur's chest tightened as the hunger rose within him, but he forced himself to focus on the task ahead. He had made his choice, and he would not let the darkness define him. Not yet. The ground shook as the vampires began to appear through the trees, their eyes glowing in the darkness like embers in a dying fire. They were fast, faster than anything human, and their forms shimmered as they moved through the night, their predatory grace almost hypnotic. Alistair was at the forefront of the group, his eyes locked on Arthur with an intensity that sent a jolt of fear through him. "So, the bloodline has awakened," Alistair said, his voice smooth and confident, a predatory grin curling his lips. "I knew it would be you, Arthur. You've always had the potential to become one of us." Arthur took a step forward, his fists clenched, the power surging through him, making him feel both invincible and terrified at the same time. "I will never be like you," he said, his voice low and filled with quiet rage. "I won't let you use me to further your curse." Alistair chuckled darkly. "You already are one of us, Arthur. There's no escaping it. You think you're in control, but deep down, you know it's already too late. The bloodline cannot be denied." Arthur could feel the heat of the hunger building within him as Alistair's words sank in. The vampires around them moved closer, their eyes hungry, anticipating the battle to come. The weight of the bloodline was too strong to ignore now, but Arthur fought against it, clenching his jaw, trying to remain in control. Sabrina stepped forward, positioning herself between Arthur and Alistair, her eyes cold as she faced the leader of the vampire pack. "We don't need to fight you, Alistair," she said, her voice steady. "We just need to end this. You have no power over us anymore." Alistair's smile widened, and he stepped closer, his gaze locked on Arthur. "You don't get it, do you? It's not just about power. It's about control. You think you've won by defeating the creature, but all you've done is awaken something far worse." Lucien's eyes flickered with a warning. "Alistair, you're playing a dangerous game." The vampire leader laughed, the sound echoing in the night. "Dangerous? Perhaps, but it's the only game worth playing. The bloodline is mine to control, and no one, not you, not Sabrina, and certainly not Arthur, will stop me." Before anyone could react, Alistair lunged forward with the speed of a predator, his claws aimed straight for Arthur. But just as the attack was about to land, Arthur's instincts kicked in. His body moved on its own, faster than he had ever imagined. His own power surging through him as he deflected the strike with inhuman strength. For a brief moment, Arthur felt the full extent of the darkness within him. Raw, untamed power that burned through his veins, fueling every movement. He had become what he had feared, but now it was his weapon, his salvation. He stared at Alistair, who was now several feet away, his eyes filled with surprise. "You are stronger than I thought," Alistair said, his grin faltering. "But you still don't understand, do you? The bloodline controls you. It will always control you." Arthur stood tall, his eyes glowing with an intensity that matched Alistair's. "Not anymore," he said, his voice a low growl. "I control my fate, and I will stop you." The night had become a battlefield. The air around them crackled with the tension of an ancient power unleashed, the weight of the curse hanging like a storm cloud above them. Arthur could feel it, the hunger, the thirst for blood, the gnawing desire to give in to the darkness. But as the bloodline surged through him, a deeper, more terrifying part of him began to awaken. The part that had been dormant, a part that was not his own. Alistair's smirk remained, though his eyes now gleamed with something darker, something more desperate. "You think you can fight this, Arthur?" he taunted, his voice dripping with malice. "You think you can fight the very nature of who you are? The bloodline will consume you. It always does." Arthur's heart pounded in his chest as the darkness within him began to stretch, like tendrils of smoke reaching for something to grasp. His mind swirled with the overwhelming need to give in, to embrace the vampire that he had become. The power was intoxicating, but at what cost? Sabrina stepped forward, her eyes locked on Arthur. "Stay strong, Arthur. You are not like them. You don't have to become what they want you to be." But Arthur could feel the pull of the bloodline tightening around him, like chains that had been forged long before his birth. It whispered to him, urging him to embrace it, promised him power, immortality. "Enough!" Arthur's voice tore through the night, filled with a rawness that reverberated in the silence. "I am not like you, Alistair, and I will never become what you are." Alistair's smile faltered for a moment, and his gaze flickered with a glint of something darker. "You're already becoming it," he whispered, almost to himself. "You feel it, don't you? The hunger, the thirst." Before Arthur could respond, the ground beneath them shook violently. The trees around them swayed as if some invisible force was tearing through the earth itself. Arthur stumbled back, his senses heightened, the overwhelming presence of something ancient, something more terrifying than Alistair, closing in on them. A deep, guttural growl echoed through the woods, shaking the very air. It wasn't just the howl of a single vampire anymore. It was the roar of an entire horde. A pack of vampires, more powerful than anything Arthur had ever imagined, and they were coming for him. From the darkness, a new figure emerged, tall and cloaked in shadows. Its form was indistinct, a blur of movement too fast for the eye to follow. But its eyes, those eyes were unmistakable. They burned with an intensity that seemed to pierce through the very soul. "You've awakened something far worse than Alistair," Sabrina said, her voice trembling with fear. "The bloodline. It calls to them. It calls to him." The figure stepped forward, and for the first time Arthur saw its face. It was a woman, or at least she appeared to be. Her features were sharp, her skin as pale as death, and her lips curled into a smile that was more a sneer than anything else. Her eyes were as black as the abyss, voids of emptiness that seemed to suck the light out of everything around her. She was ancient, older than any vampire Arthur had ever seen, older than Alistair, older than anyone. Her presence radiated with a terrifying power, and Arthur could feel it. It was as if the very air around him had thickened, like something oppressive had descended upon them. "You're too late," the woman said, her voice a cold, chilling whisper that echoed through the trees. The bloodline is mine to control, and now you will all bow before me. Arthur's body trembled, not just from fear but from something deeper. A hunger, a thirst, unlike anything he had ever known. This woman, this creature, was the true source of the curse. She was the beginning. Lucian stepped forward, his face pale, his eyes narrowed in disbelief. "Lysandra," he said, his voice tinged with both fear and reverence. "I thought you were gone. I thought you were banished." Lysandra's laugh was like the sound of dry leaves crackling in the wind, sharp, piercing, and full of malice. "You thought you could hide from me? You thought you could escape the bloodline?" She turned her eyes to Arthur. "And you, young one, you are my heir. You are the one who will bring this all back. You will bring us all into the darkness." Arthur stepped back, his heart pounding, his body thrumming with an unsettling mix of power and dread. "No," he said, shaking his head. "I will not be your heir. I will not let you control me." Lysandra's smile grew, but there was no warmth in it. "You have no choice. You are already mine. The bloodline is mine. You can feel it, can't you? The pull, the desire to join us, to join the darkness." Arthur gritted his teeth, trying to fight it, trying to resist. But the hunger was so strong now. It was as if the very essence of the night itself was calling to him, pulling him into the void. I won't let you win," Arthur said, his voice barely a whisper. Lysandra's eyes gleamed with something darker, more sinister. "You cannot stop it. You are bound to the bloodline. You are bound to me. You will join us, Arthur Blackwood. There is no escaping the night." The wind began to howl, the trees bending under the weight of the energy that surged through the air. The vampires surrounding them, Alistair's followers, moved closer, their eyes glowing with hunger, their fangs bared. Arthur's body trembled, his mind on the edge of breaking. He could feel it, the darkness, pressing against him, threatening to consume him. His senses, heightened by the bloodline, were overwhelmed by the presence of Lysandra and her army. And yet, in the depths of his mind, a voice echoed, a voice that was his own, reminding him of the choice he still had to make. "Stay strong," Sabrina said, her voice firm, though her eyes betrayed the fear she felt. "You are not just the bloodline, Arthur. You are more than that. Don't let them take you." Arthur's eyes flickered between Lysandra and Sabrina. He knew that the choice he was about to make would determine everything. His fate, the fate of those around him, and the fate of the world itself. With a roar, Arthur surged forward, his fists clenched, the power of the bloodline thrumming within him. But this time, he wasn't going to let it control him. He was going to use it to stop Lysandra, to stop the curse once and for all. The world around Arthur seemed to fade as Lysandra's presence consumed everything. The night itself grew darker, the trees stretching like twisted hands reaching toward him, as though trying to drag him into the shadows. He could feel the bloodline pulsing through his veins, its power overwhelming, its hunger insatiable. Lysandra stood before him, the embodiment of the ancient darkness that had plagued the world for centuries. Her eyes, black as the void, stared into his with a coldness that chilled him to the core. "You still don't understand, do you?" Lysandra's voice was a whisper in the wind, filled with malice. "You are not just a man anymore. You never were. The moment you embraced the bloodline, you became part of something much bigger than yourself. You are mine, Arthur." Arthur clenched his fists, the hunger gnawing at him, but his will fought against it. He could feel the darkness trying to consume him, to swallow him whole, but there was a part of him, deep within, that refused to give in. He was not just the bloodline. He was not just a weapon. He was more than that. "No," Arthur said, his voice shaking with a mixture of rage and defiance. "I will never be yours. You can't control me. Lyssandra's smile widened, revealing her sharp fangs. You think you have a choice? You think you can fight this? She took a step closer, her presence like a weight pressing down on him. You are already mine. The bloodline is mine. You cannot escape what you are. Arthur's mind raced, and for a moment, he felt the world around him shift. The hunger surged again, but this time he could feel something else rising within him. The darkness was powerful, but it was not all-consuming. It was just a part of him. He had the power to control it. He had the power to choose. The memories of his past flooded his mind, of the man he had been, of the life he had lived before all of this. He wasn't just some pawn in a bloodline. He was Arthur Blackwood, a man who had chosen to fight for something greater than himself. A man who had the strength to control his own fate. No, Arthur repeated, his voice stronger now. I choose my own path. I am not your heir. I will not join you. Lyssandra's expression darkened, her eyes flickering with a dangerous intensity. You are a fool, Arthur. You cannot fight your nature forever. It is in you, coursing through your veins. You will always return to the darkness. You will always be mine. As she spoke, the air around them seemed to tremble with power, the ground cracking beneath their feet. The vampires that had gathered around them, Alistair's followers, began to stir, their eyes glowing, their fangs bared. They moved in, circling Arthur and Sabrina, the hunger in their eyes palpable. Arthur could feel the overwhelming presence of them, vampires like him, drawn to the power he had awakened. But there was something different about them. They were no longer just mindless predators. They were creatures of the bloodline, bound to the same curse, and they were waiting for the moment when Arthur would submit, when he would give in to the darkness. But Arthur knew that moment would never come. With a sudden, swift motion, Arthur lunged forward, his speed catching even Lysandra off guard. He slammed into her, knocking her back, the force of the impact sending a shockwave through the air. The vampires surrounding them hissed, but they hesitated, unsure of what to do. Lysandra recovered quickly, her eyes blazing with fury. You dare resist? She hissed, her voice a low growl. You are nothing. You are weak. You are just another puppet in this endless game. Arthur stood tall, his body still humming with the power of the bloodline. But this time it wasn't controlling him. He was controlling it. I am more than that, he said, his voice cold with defiance. He turned to face the vampires around them, his eyes now glowing with the full power of the bloodline. If you want to fight, then fight. But know this, I will not bow to you. I will not bow to anyone. Sabrina stepped forward, her voice strong and steady. You're not alone, Arthur. We will fight with you. We won't let them take you. We won't let them win. Arthur nodded, his resolve hardening. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for Sabrina, for the world, for everything he had once believed in. And he would not let the darkness consume him. The air crackled with tension as the battle began. Lysandra and her followers surged forward, their fangs bared, their eyes burning with hunger. But Arthur, fueled by the power of the bloodline and his will to resist it, moved faster than ever before. His body was a blur of motion as he fought, his movements graceful and precise, each strike carrying the force of centuries of power. The vampires around him were strong, but they were no match for the raw power he had awakened. With each swing, he sent them reeling, knocking them back, keeping them at bay. But Lysandra was different. She was faster, more powerful, and she seemed to anticipate every move he made. She lunged at him, her claws aiming for his throat, but Arthur was ready. With a swift motion, he grabbed her wrist, his grip like iron, and twisted it, sending her crashing to the ground. You cannot stop me, Arthur, Lysandra hissed, her eyes burning with fury. You are mine. You always will be. Arthur stood over her, his eyes cold with determination. No, he said, his voice low and steady. I am my own, and I will stop you." With one final surge of power, Arthur drove his fist into Lysandra's chest, the force of the blow sending her flying back into the darkness. She let out a scream, a final cry of defeat, as she vanished into the shadows, her power crumbling beneath his touch. The remaining vampires hesitated, their eyes flickering with uncertainty. They had seen the fall of their leader, and the fear began to set in. Arthur turned to face them, his eyes burning with the intensity of the bloodline. They were nothing compared to him now. "We end this now," Arthur said, his voice filled with finality. And as the vampires scattered, fleeing into the night, Arthur knew that the battle was far from over. The darkness still lingered, but now it was something he could control. It was something he had conquered. The battle had left the land scarred, and yet the war was far from over. Arthur stood at the edge of the darkened forest, his breath slow and steady, his senses heightened as the remnants of the night's conflict faded into silence. The air was thick with the remnants of blood, his own, and that of the vampires he had fought. But even in the stillness, he knew the true test was just ahead. The darkness was not finished with him yet. Sabrina approached, her expression grim but determined. The faintest traces of her wounds lingered on her, but she stood strong, her resolve unshaken. "You did it, Arthur," she said, her voice quiet but filled with respect. "Lysandra is gone, but the bloodline, the curse, it's still out there. The battle isn't over." Arthur's amber eyes flashed, his gaze distant. "No, it's not over, but I'm not the same as I was before. I have the power to end it, to end the curse once and for all." Sabrina looked at him, the weight of his words sinking in. "The bloodline, the darkness, it's in you now. You've become something other, but that power isn't just a weapon. It's a burden. Don't forget that. Don't forget who you were." Arthur clenched his fists, the hunger still lingering in the back of his mind, gnawing at him. It was harder to control now, harder to keep in check. The bloodline was part of him, intertwined with every fiber of his being, and its pull was always there, waiting, whispering, coaxing him into the darkness. "I won't forget who I am," Arthur said, his voice low, filled with quiet conviction. "I won't let the curse define me." But as he spoke, he felt a tremor ripple through the earth beneath him. The ground began to shake, the air growing thick with power. He felt it before he saw it. The presence of something immense, something ancient, something far more dangerous than anything they had faced before. The darkness was gathering again. "There's no time," Sabrina said urgently, pulling Arthur from his thoughts. "They're coming. Alistair's followers, the ones who remain. The final battle is upon us." Arthur turned to face the distant horizon, where the faintest glow of a rising moon lit the sky. He could feel the vampires drawing closer, their power overwhelming. He could sense their hunger, their thirst for vengeance. "They won't stop until they have everything," Arthur muttered, his eyes narrowing. "The bloodline in me. I'll never give in. But I can't do this alone." Sabrina stepped forward, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're not alone, Arthur. We fight together. We fight for the light, for what's left of humanity." Arthur nodded, determination flooding his veins. The bloodline may have awakened within him, but it was his choice now. He would decide his fate. He would fight to the very end to break the curse once and for all. But as the first of Alistair's followers appeared on the horizon, their eyes glowing with hunger and fury, Arthur realized the full weight of what was coming. The battle would not be an easy one. The darkness was powerful, but so was he, and this time he would control it. The vampires moved with terrifying speed, their forms blurring in the darkness, their eyes fixed on Arthur with predatory intent. They had seen the fall of Lysandra, and now they sought vengeance. They were the remnants of a long, cursed lineage, creatures of the night, bound to the very bloodline Arthur carried within him. Arthur stood at the front, his body humming with the power of the bloodline, his eyes glowing with the same amber fire that burned within them all. But this time it was different. He was not the man he had been when he first stepped into this nightmare. He had embraced the darkness, and with it, the power to fight it. Sabrina stood beside him, her eyes filled with determination. "We end this now," she said, her voice unwavering. "We fight and we win. We will not let them take you, Arthur." Arthur met her gaze, his resolve hardening. "We won't let them take anything. This ends tonight." The first of the vampires lunged at them, its speed too fast for the human eye to follow. But Arthur was ready. With a single swipe, he caught the vampire's wrist, twisting it with inhuman strength. The creature howled in pain, but before it could retaliate, Arthur drove his fist into its chest, sending it crashing to the ground. One by one, the vampires attacked, their fangs bared, their eyes glowing with fury. But Arthur was faster, stronger. The bloodline within him surged to life, responding to the battle, granting him the power to fight back. He moved like a blur, knocking vampires aside, his strength and speed unmatched by anything human. But even as he fought, he could feel the hunger growing inside him, the pull of the bloodline, urging him to give in, to take what was rightfully his. He had to fight it, had to remain in control. He could not let the darkness consume him. Sabrina fought beside him, her movements fluid and precise as she dispatched vampires with deadly efficiency. But Arthur could see the toll the battle was taking on her. She was strong, but she was not immortal. And with each passing second, the vampires seemed to grow in number. "Arthur," Sabrina called out, her voice filled with urgency. "We can't hold them off much longer. We need to end this now." Arthur turned to face her, his eyes glowing with a mixture of determination and desperation. "We need to find their leader," he said, his voice sharp. "Alistair. He's the one who's been pulling the strings. He's the one who can end this." Sabrina nodded, and together, they pushed forward, cutting through the vampires like a storm. The battle raged around them, but Arthur kept his focus, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Alistair had to be close. He had to be. And then, as if summoned by Arthur's thoughts, Alistair appeared, his figure emerging from the shadows like a phantom. His eyes glowed with a dark fire, his smile twisted with malice. "Arthur," he said, his voice low and filled with amusement. "I knew you'd come. You always were the one who would make this interesting." Arthur's heart pounded in his chest. This was it, the final confrontation. He could feel the bloodline surging within him, ready to consume him, ready to finish what had been started centuries ago. But this time it was different. This time Arthur was in control. "You've lost, Alistair," Arthur said, his voice steady. "This ends tonight." Alistair's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold fury. "You think you've won, don't you?" he sneered. "You think you can destroy everything I've built? You are nothing but a puppet. And now you will join us or you will die." With a roar, Alistair lunged at Arthur, his fangs bared, his claws aimed straight for his heart. But Arthur was ready. He raised his hand, channeling the full power of the bloodline, and with a blast of energy, sent Alistair flying back into the darkness. "You are wrong, Alistair," Arthur said, his voice cold. "I will not be your puppet. I will end this once and for all." The final confrontation was upon them. The air was thick with tension, the energy of the battle buzzing around them like an electric storm. Arthur stood tall, his eyes glowing with the power of the bloodline, the dark energy flowing through him in a steady, rhythmic pulse. He had come so far, further than he had ever thought possible, and now he stood before Alistair, the leader of the vampire army, the one who had been the cause of so much suffering, both for Arthur and for the world. Alistair's eyes gleamed with malice, his lips curling into a twisted grin. "You're still fooling yourself, Arthur," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "You think you can control this power? You think you can control the bloodline? You're just like me. You will fall to it. It is in your veins, and it will consume you. Arthur clenched his fists, the bloodline within him pulsing like a heartbeat. He could feel the pull of the darkness, the hunger that threatened to swallow him whole. But he had already made his choice. He wasn't just the bloodline. He was more than that. And no matter how strong the darkness was, he would not let it define him. I am not like you, Alistair, Arthur said, his voice steady, his eyes unwavering. I have the strength to control it. I will not let the darkness consume me, and I will stop you once and for all. Alistair laughed, a cruel, hollow sound that echoed through the forest. You think you're the one in control? You think you can defeat me? The bloodline has already chosen you, Arthur. You are mine. Arthur felt the pull of the bloodline, the weight of the curse pressing against him, but he stood firm. He would not back down. Not now. The ground beneath them began to tremble, and the trees seemed to bend with the force of the energy building between them. The vampires who had gathered around them, watching the battle unfold, stood still, their eyes glowing with anticipation. The final fight had begun. Alistair lunged at Arthur with lightning speed. His claws aimed straight for his chest, but Arthur was ready. With a surge of power, he moved faster than he had ever moved before, sidestepping the attack and striking with a powerful blow to Alistair's side. The force of the hit sent the vampire flying backward, crashing into a nearby tree, splintering it in half. Arthur's heart raced, adrenaline coursing through his veins. But he knew this was only the beginning. Alistair was stronger than any vampire he had faced before, and he was relentless. But Arthur was no longer the man he had been when he first arrived in this cursed world. He had embraced the darkness, and now he would use it to defeat Alistair and end the curse once and for all. Alistair rose from the ground, his eyes burning with fury. You can't defeat me, Arthur, he sneered. You are nothing but a tool. The bloodline will always control you. Arthur didn't answer. He lunged forward, his fists and feet moving with the grace and speed of a predator. He struck again and again, each blow landing with precision, but Alistair was a skilled fighter. He dodged and countered, his claws slashing through the air, narrowly missing Arthur's skin. The battle raged on, their movements a blur as they clashed, each trying to overpower the other. The air was thick with the sound of punches and kicks, the crackle of energy from their blows reverberating through the night. Sabrina, who had been standing on the sidelines, her eyes filled with worry, finally stepped forward. She knew Arthur could handle himself, but the danger was real, and the weight of the bloodline, the curse, was more than anyone could bear alone. Arthur, she shouted, her voice strong. You can do this. You control the darkness. Don't let it control you. Arthur heard her voice, and for a moment, the pull of the bloodline seemed to weaken. He glanced over at Sabrina, her eyes filled with belief, with hope. She was the reason he had fought so hard. She was the one who had reminded him of who he was, what he stood for. With a roar, Arthur pushed forward, his body moving faster than ever. He reached Alistair, striking with the full force of the bloodline's power. And this time, he didn't hold back. He drove his fist into Alistair's chest, feeling the force of the blow tear through the vampire's flesh. Alistair let out a scream of pain as he staggered backward, his eyes wide with disbelief. No, he gasped. This can't be. No. Arthur didn't stop. He moved forward, his eyes glowing with the power of the bloodline. But this time, he wasn't consumed by it. He controlled it. He was the darkness now, but he chose to fight it. With one final, devastating blow, Arthur struck Alistair in the heart, his hand sinking deep into the vampire's chest. Alistair's scream was cut short, his body going limp as the last of his life drained away. Arthur stood over him, breathing heavily, his body still thrumming with the power of the bloodline. But as Alistair's body crumpled to the ground, a wave of relief washed over him. The darkness that had threatened to consume him, that had tried to claim him, was finally gone. The vampires who had gathered around them, Alistair's followers, saw their leader fall, and their eyes flickered with fear. Without Alistair, they were leaderless, their power no longer a threat. One by one, they began to retreat, their hunger and rage dissipating as they realized they had lost. Sabrina stepped forward, her eyes searching Arthur's face. "You did it," she whispered, a smile tugging at her lips. "You stopped him. You stopped them all." Arthur looked down at the fallen body of Alistair, his mind still racing with everything that had happened. The battle had been long and the cost had been high, but in the end, the curse had been broken. He had fought the darkness within himself and won. He had chosen to be free. "Is it over?" Arthur asked, his voice filled with a quiet exhaustion. Sabrina nodded, her smile growing wider. "It's over." Arthur looked up at the sky, the first rays of dawn breaking through the dark clouds. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the world was still, and for the first time he felt truly free.